let's talk about 30 crochet blanket patterns. Hi, my name is Emily Crow from The Crowsy Crow, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we are doing a very exciting roundup. I haven't done a roundup in a while, but this roundup is 30 crochet blanket patterns that I think would be perfect for the Bookish Blanket Make-a-long that I am hosting coming up in just a few days. Basically, this all started because I realized I've been accumulating quite a bit of yarn, either from yarn clubs or even from dyers who have bookish related collections. And I wanted to use some of these yarns all together in a cohesive project to celebrate my love for books. I know not everyone has book themed yarn, so I thought it would be really great to host a make-along where the goal is really to use up full skeins of yarn for a big project like a blanket or a schlanket, shawl blanket, that would be perfect for cozying up with a really good book as the weather is cooling down and things are getting cozy and we're staying inside more and just enjoying ourselves as the weather is cooling down in the Northern Hemisphere. So I'll talk a little bit more about this Bookish Blanket Make-a-long later on in the video, and I'll definitely come out with a separate video with all the details, so keep an eye out for that. But I wanted to share some patterns I found that are crochet related that are really good for using up full skeins of yarn together, because for this make-along, you're gonna have to use up a minimum of 4 full skeins of yarn. It's really not intended for advents or scrappy projects, mini skeins, things like that. It's intended for using up full skeins of yarn all together in a blanket type project. So let's jump right in and take a look at these 30 patterns that I've compiled that I think would be a really good fit for this make-along. First and foremost, this is the Hexapuff Lap Quilt by Julie Blagojevich. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. If you have heard of the Beekeeper's Quilt, but you're a crocheter and you want to make something like it, this is your substitute. This uses fingering weight yarn, and basically you're making these little pockets that are hexagon shaped that you can then stuff and then close up, join together. So you have this like puffy blanket that almost has like more weight to it because they're filled. And this pattern was in fact inspired by the Beekeeper's Quilt by Tiny Owl Knits. If you want to learn more about some knit blanket patterns, I have a whole roundup of knit blanket patterns that are also good for this make-along, and the Beekeeper's Quilt is on that list. So I'll make sure to link that video down below if you want to watch that as well. But yeah, if you're looking for a crochet version of the Hexapuffs, this is fingering weight and this would be a good fit for you. You could easily make this blanket as big or as small as you want. You can pick where your colors go if you want to be really intentional about maybe like a pixelated image you want to do, or like little flower motifs with all your hexies and how the colors are laid out, or you can do things randomly if you want to. Another more modular blanket, this is called the Origami blanket by Kirsten Ballering. This is just really visually interesting to see because you've got all these little triangles that meet together to make squares, and then multiple different square color combinations make larger squares. And so you can definitely see where the color play is really interesting in a piece like this. This uses fingering weight yarn and it is available for free. Looks like maybe on Scipious's website, potentially. Anyway, this is beautiful. I really love how the colors play together. There's also this like subtle fading of colors from one end of the blanket to the next. This would be a little harder to plan your colors out for if you were limited in how many colors you have, but it looks like this pattern itself gives you a lot of direction if you just want to follow the pattern as written in how your colors are laid out. So it would give you a lot of help that way. And as long as you like lay it all out, you could still plan where you want your colors to go. If you have a particular color plan in mind and you don't necessarily want to follow exactly the number of colors and the orientation that this designer has. And what's amazing is that crochet patterns use up way more yarn than knitting patterns. So if you have a lot of stash you want to pull for this, these patterns would be really good for that. This blanket uses about 5,000 yards of yarn. So yeah, that's a lot to use up some stuff in your stash. Here's another companion pattern for one that's on the knitting roundup list. This is the Bandwagon blanket by Beth Graham. It is a free Ravelry download. So again, if you want to jump on the bandwagon of these mitered squares, this is like the coziest memory blanket by Kemper Way. And while this is really a good project for scraps, minis, things like that. It's a really good way to highlight specific colors that you really, really loved and maybe look back on the projects you've made with those. So it's really great for scraps, of course. But you could also make your mitered squares a lot bigger than what the pattern originally calls for. It would be really easy to continue the increasing to get the shaping that you want for a larger square. That would not be hard to do, and to follow the same format but on a larger scale, but just in larger dimensions for your individual squares. You could also make these little squares if you really wanted to, and just use up full skeins of yarn by planning out where your colors are going, or kind of having them like smattered throughout the blanket in a random way if you wanted to. So you could still use up full skeins of yarn in the little miter square design, or you can make them into big miter squares. This next pattern, you've probably heard of it before. This is the Battenberg blanket by Sandra Paul, and this also uses fingering weight yarn. This uses a ton of a main color as well. So if you want to kind of bring in a lot of yarns, maybe from different dyers or across an entire club, so there's lots of skeins to play around with and you're not sure color palette wise how they're all going to go together if you have like 12 different colors of yarn. You can also have this main color that kind of makes everything cohesive and blends everything together. I know that Nitty Natty is working on blanket squares using the same little Battenberg blanket pattern, but making the squares a lot bigger. And so that's definitely an option for you if you really don't want to work on like lots of little squares. But this is a free pattern, so it's easy to pull information from and just make these solid squares, whatever size you want. Honestly, it'd be super easy to just make them the size you were looking for and to join all of these blanket squares together. The way the pattern is originally written is for a massive blanket. Honestly, it looks really big. It doesn't say what size it is on this Ravelry page, but you could use up a ton of yarn. Another staple in crochet is the corner to corner blanket. So here is one I think would be really good for this make along. This is the Scrappy corner to corner baby blanket by Cintia Gonzalez. And if you are not super comfortable with a corner to corner blanket, this would be a good pattern to follow. It is free and it would definitely teach you the techniques that you're looking for if this is a new skill for you to learn. It's a very scrappy look, but you could make big color blocks of different colors. It uses DK weight yarn, which is fingering weight held double or just DK weight by itself. So a really good way to use up some yarn in your stash. I don't know about you, but I have a lot of fingering weight yarn because I find it very versatile. And so being able to hold it double, whether I want to marl my yarn, have two separate colors and see how the colors play together, or maybe fade from one color to another, or have color blocks of holding the same color double on itself. All of those are really good options for a blanket like this, and you can really decide how you want your blanket to look color-wise as you are playing around with these full skeins of yarn instead of scraps. Maybe you could also use scraps in your project. I didn't say you can't use scraps. I just said for this make-along, you need to use up at least 4 full skeins of yarn. So you can use up a gajillion minis and advent skeins if you want, in conjunction with the minimum 4 full skeins, if that's what you like. This is a really cute, like wavy pattern in a blanket. This is the Crochet Advent Baby Blanket Fingering by Lucien Crochet. Like the title suggests, it is fingering weight yarn. And while this uses an advent as kind of a gradient throughout the pattern with a main color used in between each color to kind of make them stand out more, you could again make your sections larger. You can use the same handful of colors for like a weekly countdown calendar. Maybe you have 4 to 5 full skeins of yarn from a weekly countdown that you have purchased from in the past, and you could stripe those colors or make each section a little larger. It really is up to you, but you could definitely alter this pattern to accommodate full skeins of yarn if you're trying to participate in this make along and not using mini skeins. I would be remiss if I didn't include some Toni Lipsey blankets on this pattern list because she has so many blanket patterns. Now, she works a lot with worsted weight yarn. I mentioned this in my knit blanket roundup, but gauge only matters if it matters to you for a blanket. As long as your gauge is consistent throughout the blanket, you shouldn't have big issues. if you're flexible. Now, if you want to learn more about adjusting a pattern like a blanket to use different weight of yarn, how to understand how your gauge changes and the implications for the pattern you're working on, like if you decide to use DK yarn instead of worsted weight yarn for this upcoming pattern, how is that going to make a difference in the size you're looking for? If you're flexible and you're just using up yarn and having a fun time, it might not be a problem, but if you're trying really hard to use up a specific amount of yarn or to have a specific dimension in your project, you might want to know about your gauge, even if you're not following the gauge of the pattern. So if you want to learn more about that, I'm happy to make a video about using simple math and gauge to learn more about your project and plan ahead more. So let me know if you want to see a video like that from me. But let's talk about these patterns from Toni Lipsey that, even though they're worsted weight yarn for their gauge, I think would be a really good fit for this make-along. This first pattern is the Daphne Afghan. I really love that this blanket is made up of, it looks like 4 different triangles that use a granny stitch motif, and then you seam them all together to get this really beautiful X design. I think that there's definitely some granny square patterns on this list, but I didn't want to rely exclusively on granny squares because that's not everyone's cup of tea. But this is a really fun and modern take on the granny stripe. So if you don't mind a granny stitch, but you want to do something a little different than just granny squares for days, this is a good option for you. And a free option is available on her website. She does have extensive pattern lists on her website. A couple other Toni Lipsey patterns. This is the Theo blanket. This one, again, worsted weight. I really like this motif and how it kind of starts as a small square and gets larger and larger. It's just a really fun shaping of this blanket, and you can easily see how just using a handful of colors is a really striking color palette while also having a main color that kind of ties it all together. It would be very easy to adjust your size by just continuing the same pattern for your pattern and making it a larger blanket. That would not be hard at all. It kind of looks like it uses like a linen stitch or something. It does use linen stitch. I was right. Linen stitch is really drapey, really simple, fairly mindless to do, and honestly one of my faves. And so I definitely recommend this pattern. I think this would be a really good one to work on with just a handful of DK weight skeins. This one might be Toni's last pattern in this pattern roundup. This is the Linen Square Temp Blanket by Toni Lipsey. And this one uses a huge range of colors for a temperature blanket. And each of the 12 big squares is made up of all the different colors needed for signifying the temperature of that month. So each square is like a month. But guess what? We don't have to make it a temperature blanket. We can crochet this blanket where each square is a different full color. So it would be a much less stripy and scrappy look, but you could easily capture like 12 different colors of yarn, one for each of the big main squares of the pattern all together. So if you have a monthly yarn club in your stash, you can easily pull from it for this. And again, a linen stitch. I love a linen stitch. It wouldn't be too hard to adapt this pattern for not changing your color every single round. Another granny stitch type blanket pattern. This is the Colorful Granny Stitch Blanket by Briana K Designs. Again, she has it for free on her website if you want to look, but there is a purchasable ad-free version like a lot of these designers do. What I really love about this is that even though it is using granny stitch, the way that the colors are set up gives a really cool like diamond shape. I don't know, I really like this. This is very different than other granny stitch type patterns. I really like how the colors play together, and this would be a really good way to use up a handful of colors in your stash. Again, worsted weight, so you'd have to play around with gauge and how the sizing of your blanket is altered by using not worsted weight yarn if you want to use something different, but it wouldn't be hard to make that accommodation if you feel comfortable with that. Some more color blocking related patterns. This is the Waffle-icious Blanket by MJ's Off the Hook Designs. I love a good waffle stitch, both in knitting and crochet. It's just so squishy and yummy, and I really love the color palette for this pattern, first of all. But it is a DK weight gauge, which is not hard to do. You can combine 2 strands of fingering weight yarn, or you can just use a DK weight yarn and you can crochet this pattern. There's some cool color blocking. You can repeat colors if you want to. You can have an actual main color to kind of tie it all together, or you can just color block the entire thing with different contrast colors and use up all of your full skeins of yarn that you were looking to use up. But I think this would be really easy to use up just a handful of skeins together and using main skein to tie it all together. Though this might be a little bit trickier if you want to do big color blocks because the pattern calls for multiple 100-gram balls of each color. So you'd probably have to do smaller stripes if you just had one skein of each color, or this would be a really good pattern to pull from your stash if you have blanket quantity of yarn just kind of hanging around that needs a home. I love the look of this blanket. Another more modular design. This is 4 Points Baby Blanket in Linen Quill by Purl Soho. I've got a few Purl Soho patterns on the knitting roundup as well. And what I love about this is it is free because it is from Purl Soho. Really good way to use up fingering weight yarn, and you only need one skein of each color to make this cute little baby blanket. It would be really easy to continue the pattern into a larger size if you want, but you would just need more yarn if that's what you're looking for. Very modular, very simple design, easy way to showcase a color palette of 4 skeins that you think look really good together, but you want them to be distinct from each other because they are all very distinct in their section. So this would be really good for variegated yarn. Another more color blocking type of pattern is the 12 Peaks Blanket by Kaitlin Ostafew. And this is in her new book, The Art of Crochet with Sock Weight Yarn. I don't know how well you can see that, but it looks like you can also buy it from her Ravelry, which is awesome if you don't have the book. Though the pattern's $6, the book is not that expensive. So if you know you like a handful of patterns in the book, I'd recommend you get it because I think it's awesome. But this is intended for fingering weight held double into a DK weight yarn, which again could be really good for having intense color blocks of holding the same yarn double, or having a marled or a faded look between multiple colors by holding 2 different colorways together. I think sky's the limit for you, honestly. This uses linen or moss stitch also, which again is a love of mine. And this has these like little chevron arrows. So it's a little bit different of a shaping, not quite as simple as just like a square or doing strips. You would be doing increasing and decreasing to maintain that shape. And it looks like you would need 9 to 12 skeins of fingering weight yarn. So it would be a really good way to use up a monthly club if you have that. This actually might be a really good choice for, I have the Swift Reads Club from Yarnaceous Fibers, and we're about halfway through the club. There's gonna be, I think, 13 skeins total. And so I wanted to do like 12 skeins together and then probably use the 13th for the border or something. This would be a really good pattern to use with that. So I don't have all my colorways yet because we are only partway through the year. It runs this whole year, but that might be a really good project for this. I'm gonna throw this in my queue so I don't lose track of that because I think that's a great idea. For Swift Reads Club? Question mark. I will consider that later for early next year. Maybe we should do another make-along next year once I have acquired all my clubs for the year. This could be a yearly thing, a really good fall cozy make-along. A couple more patterns from Kaitlin Ostafew because she has some really good blanket patterns. These two are kind of a little match made in heaven. This is At the Hearth blanket, which uses fingering weight yarn. I love this like stair step look because each of the different squares kind of alternates in its orientation. This is a really beautiful way to use up some yarns that maybe a handful of them really coordinate well together and the other handful coordinate well with each other. So you want to keep those like 2 miniature palettes together. I think this would be a really good way to like play with your colors and make decisions like that. Or you could mix it up and do something really fun with where you place your colors. It would use quite a bit of a main color to kind of join everything together. And so you could also do that instead if you want to use mini skeins or advents or scraps for all the different little stripes. You can have a main color, kind of pull it all together, make it cohesive, and still be eligible for this make along, even if you're using small bits of yarn for the contrast colors. But there are 4 different sizes: baby, toddler, lapgan, and throw. So you could use anywhere from like 1,000 yards to like 6,000 yards. So you have a lot of flexibility in how big you want to make your blanket, what size you want to make. And I really like the fact that this pattern allows for that, so that if you are not feeling like doing all the math yourself, you can just follow her sizing to make sure you end up with the right amount of squares. And then the sister pattern for that pattern is the Layer Cake Blanket, also by Kaitlin Ostafew. And this uses DK weight yarn in a very similar style. It looks like the construction is almost identical. Instead of using 6 different contrast colors, you're using only 3 different contrast colors in this fade. Really pretty. So yeah, gives you some options if you want to rely on DK weight versus fingering weight. You can look at both of these patterns from Kaitlin. It is hot and I want it to be fall. We're halfway through this list. This next pattern is called the Juni throw. And if you love the wavy, chevron-y type of look in a blanket, this pattern by Katie Peterson is a really good fit for you. Again, it is written in worsted weight, but would not be hard to adjust. Looks like the pattern was exclusively part of a blanket club through Jimmy Bean's Wool. So it looks like you'd have to purchase the pattern from them if you really like it. I love this like motion of all these different colors because it's not angular like a chevron normally is. It's very much a wave. Really good way to showcase all sorts of different colors. You could maybe fade them from one side to the other or keep them random to make them really distinct. Would be really easy to play around with. You could also make your stripes larger if you want to accommodate full skeins of fingering weight yarn, or smaller. You could really play around with it a lot. We're almost done with these more like color block style blankets. This is the modified sedge stitch baby blanket by Nicole Mansfield. This sedge stitch is such a squishy texture. It just looks so scrumptious. And again, this is really good for color blocking and then putting a border on it to kind of make it all cohesive. This uses worsted weight yarn, but would be really easy to adapt. If you're not familiar with the sedge stitch, this might be a really good pattern to pick up so you can learn a new stitch and then you can extrapolate that out to whatever size blanket you want at whatever gauge you want. Would not be hard. This is a very simple pattern, but I really like these stripes of color blocking. This color blocked pattern is called the Tranquility Blanket by Goody or Agat Rotman. And this is a pretty new pattern. It's only about a year old. I really like that not only do you have this cool way to coordinate a handful of colors together, again, worsted weight, apparently worsted weight crochet blankets are the way to go, but would not be hard to adapt. This pattern is available for free. What I really like about this pattern is not only do you have these color blocked stripes, but you also have different texture in each of these different sections. So it would be really fun to work up. I feel like a lot of blanket patterns are good for mindless crocheting. And while that is also the case, I think with a pattern like this, if you want something a little bit more interesting, has a little bit more texture to it, this would be a really good option for you so that you don't peter out a third of the way through the blanket because you're just doing the same stitch for what feels like miles and miles of crocheting. So this would be good to kind of keep your interest with each different color stripe doing a different texture. You could highlight a lot of different colors. Some of these examples do that. Some of them only have 3 to 4 colors. If you had multiple skeins of certain colors, you could still utilize them, but this would be a really good way to use up full skeins in these big color blocks. I have 2 book specific blankets that I want to share with you. This first one is the Snuggle Up with a Book Blanket by H.A.E. Barker. This is so fun. I love all the different elements in here. There's like a little vase of flowers that gives a little bit more texture to this colorwork blanket. There's like a little kitty motif, and I don't know how much the pattern leaves these motifs up to you, that like you can kind of pick which ones you want to include and where you want to include them versus there's just a chart for the pattern that you follow. But so cool, and would be really neat to embroider on names for specific books that you really want to showcase on a blanket like this. And you can see the designer did that for just a couple of these books, but you could easily use just a handful of colors and really narrow in on what color palette you want to do, or you could pull a lot of different book themed yarns to add to this blanket. I think that this would look so cool with some beautiful variegated yarns and some well-chosen contrast colors to do like these cool spine details. It'd be so fun to have like a little crocheted cat on the blanket. This is just so cool. It uses DK weight yarn, which is awesome. That means fingering held double or just DK weight, which are a lot easier to find from like independent dyer yarn clubs. And so if you have a collection of yarns like I do, you could definitely pull from that to make this blanket. The other bookish blanket that I want to highlight is the Mosaic Bookcase Extended by Wendy Thompson. So I think this pattern came out originally as like a pillow, and then the extension came out which made it into like a throw blanket size. So if you wanted to make a larger size than just like a tiny blanket, you could get the extended version of the pattern. And this one I know is a little bit more modular, like each of the different rows, you can kind of interchange where they go. And this one is really beautiful with just a couple different colors. So you could easily highlight just a few colors that way. Or again, you could mix up which colors you use on which books. So you could really play around with this and have a lot of fun. Though I like the more minimal color palette of the designer's option that they made. Again, really interesting bookshelves with some really fun, like, looks like pottery and like knickknacks intermixed with some of the books too. So if you want to make a bookcase looking blanket, then this would be really fun to make. This is also using DK weight yarn. It uses mosaic crochet, as you would expect, which is a really straightforward way to do crochet colorwork designs. We are moving into my favorite section of this roundup. We're going to talk about patterns that look like actual quilts, like quilting fabric, quilting design quilts, but they are crocheted. This first one is called the Beach Walk Blanket by Marian Mitchell. This is so colorful and intricate, all these little squares. There's different sizes of squares too. It's just so much visual interest in this blanket, and yet it still looks really cohesive in the color palette that this designer chose, and I think it looks really beautiful. It was a really good way to highlight a lot of different colors together, and by just having one or two colors to do the outside borders or to join things together, you still get a cohesive look. This is DK weight yarn. It would use up so much. I wish I had the actual yardage here, but you could easily start making this blanket from the center and then working your way outwards as long as you have yarn available. And so you could easily adjust the size just by not including the outer edges of the blanket. Another quilty pattern. This is Quiet Sky by Anita Gibney. Again, this is a beautiful color palette. This is a very traditional quilted look with these quilted stars. If you look closely, each of the star squares has a lot of different small squares included, and that's very typical for actual quilting, where you're piecing together these small pieces to build larger pieces, and as you finish the larger piece, you get to see the actual image that you've been working up this whole time. Very much like that, there's solid squares, and then there's squares that are 50-50 different colors. There's a little bit of striping to get this like really cool little square in the middle of each of these star shapes. Really good way to highlight a handful of colors, that you could also highlight more colors by making each square its own entity, its own color palette that you're focusing on, and then throwing all the squares together in a big project. You would still see those beautiful colors and the beautiful layout of all those star shapes. This uses DK weight yarn. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. This would use anywhere from 4,200 yards to 5,000 yards. So lots and lots of yarn in use for this size. Though again, it'd be really easy to make it smaller by just making fewer of those big star squares and just, you know, making do with what you have. But this is a lot of yarn for a large project. Looks like it would probably fit a queen size bed from the picture, if not a full bed. A little hard to tell when I can't read it here. It says it's a throw, but it's pretty big. It can fit over this whole bed as the pattern is written. Another quilty blanket. This is the Quilt Star Throw by Jane Snedden Peaver. This definitely looks more throw size. This is reminiscent of, from the knitting one, the one that I really love, Quinn's Quilt by Marinja Knits. And I love how it's got this cool like multi-pointed star look. It's got this really interesting rhombus shapes that you kind of make with all the adding together of the little squares to make the big square picture. This uses worsted weight yarn as written in the pattern. It is a throw size blanket, which makes sense from the name, but easy to adjust and to kind of hone in on your color palette if you want to, or include lots and lots of different colors if you have a club. This pattern just came out earlier this year. Super cute. And I love this border of like the small like granny squares around the edge, these small circular granny squares that are joined together. That's just a really beautiful detail that I think really ties it together. Okay, final quilt-like pattern. This is the Nordic Star Sunburst Blanket by Mallory Krall. I have really adored Mallory Krall's patterns. She has a lot on this list, but they are coming. I kept them all together. So this is made with DK weight yarn, and it uses a lot of a main color, but it's really good to highlight all of these really bright, distinct, variegated yarns that are used for this really cool like sunburst effect on the blanket. This uses a little over 4,000 yards of yarn and would be really good to highlight a handful of colors. I wonder if it says how many colors this pattern is written for as is. Looks like it's only within the pattern itself that it tells you how many colors the pattern calls for. You could definitely branch out and make it your own, but if you want to just follow along with the pattern, you can use a handful of colors in full skeins to follow the pattern as it is written if you don't want to plan out your own colors. And it uses a lot of a main skein, so you wouldn't need to use a ton of each individual contrast color like you would for some of these other patterns. Though you might have to adapt this because I can't tell if it uses more than one full skein of yarn per contrast color as the pattern is currently written. You might have to adapt it to accommodate just single skeins of a colorway. I'm not sure because I don't own this pattern. Some other Mallory Crawl patterns I really love. This one is the Astrid blanket, and I have crocheted this before. I used my Wilbury Fiber Co. Book Society box colorways. I really like for this pattern that you can either do solid colors for the entire square if you really wanted to, or each round could be a different color, which is what I did for my book blanket. And I'll make sure to link those videos down below if you want to see me opening those book boxes as well as working on the blanket, because I finished it earlier this year. I was hoping to finish it last December, but I totally ran out of time. I did not have time last December. I modified the pattern a little bit to add a fourth round onto this pattern, so I have 2 rounds of puff stitches, and that wasn't too hard to do. Again, in those videos I have instructions on how I did that, and then you join everything together with main skeins. So what I did for mine, I used 16 full skeins of fingering weight yarn. I held the yarn double because this pattern is for DK weight, and then I had 7 skeins of Swish DK, I think, from Knit Picks to join everything together. And it was the perfect amount of yarn. And I even used some of that Swish DK to fill in some gaps in like the layout that I planned. Anyway, that's all in my video. I really enjoyed working on this pattern, and it's really what started my love for blankets and made me want to make more. So I definitely recommend this pattern. You can play around with it. You can follow my modifications if you want, or you can just follow the pattern as Mallory wrote it to begin with. Another pattern by her, if you don't want to make squares, but you want to make something that is like granny square style, this is the Terracotta Coastline Hexi blanket, and this uses hexagon shapes. This uses DK weight yarn. I love how each of them is a single color, and so it really showcases the color that she chose for each of these hexagons. This would be really easy to use up full skeins of yarn on a handful of each of these hexes, and then just like kind of laying them all out how you want them to then join them together. And these little, like, I don't know if those are pom-poms or little like ties or whatever on the edge of the blanket is just such a fun detail. The pattern will have all your quantities of each of the different colors, but I wouldn't be surprised if you only have 1 to 2 skeins of each of the contrast colors, and then you have multiple skeins of the main color to join it all together. Last one by Mallory Crawl. This one's a little bit different. This is the Summer Fade Hexi blanket, again using the hexes. And this again uses DK weight yarn, so fingering held double or DK. And I really like this fade of the main color, that like white creamy color, and then having these stripes of hexes in different colors all the way down with some interspersed main color hexes as well. So you can clearly see where each of these different colors is used. The layout is already planned out for you, which is really nice. And this is just really fun how the visual weight of the blanket is different on either end. So it's just more visually interesting, I feel like, than having all these hexes mixed up together. So this is a very different look than the other hexi blankets, but I really like this one too. We're on the hexi train. Let's talk about the Hexi Blooms blanket by Kirsten Morgan. This one just came out 2 months ago, super, super recent. And for these hexes, you can see that the designer made little flower motifs. As you see all these like flower patterns within the full pattern of the blanket. So this would be a really good way to play around with colors. It looks like there's another example where she did kind of like a zigzag. It's a little bit different of a layout. So you could play around with how you lay out your hexes to make whatever image you are looking for. But this is fingering weight yarn, which is really nice. So a lighter weight blanket and would not guzzle quite as much yarn as holding fingering double for a DK weight blanket, though you could definitely make this huge, and the pattern calls for that. It says you could use up to 6,500 yards of yarn That's a lot. So you can make this blanket massive, but you can really do that for most of these patterns. They're very flexible in how big you want to make your dimensions. All right, another blanket square type pattern. This is the Florentine's blanket by Sandra Paul. We've seen that name before on this list. This is fingering weight held double, and this is a really beautiful like flower type texture. And even in variegated yarns, as you can see from their picture, it looks really stunning, this texture. And then you use a couple main colors to kind of finish off your square, square it off, join your squares together, do a border. So you could easily use a lot of different full skeins of yarn to make this pattern. If you really want to use advents or scraps or minis for this make along and you want to hit your, minimum of 4 full skeins of yarn, you could easily use up 4 full skeins of yarn through this pattern by counting all the yarn that you're using to square off these shapes, to join all the squares together, all that stuff. So it would still be really easy for you to make an eligible blanket for this make along, even if you want to use up a lot of advents or scraps. And then the final blanket, oh, this one is so pretty. This is the Bahia blanket by Mia Demmer or Vicavira. And this blanket is inspired by the tiled floors of the Bahia Palace located in Marrakech. Beautiful history related to this pattern and the shaping. I like how there's different shapes of granny squares. So you have your like little squares, but then you have even tinier squares at each of the corners. And then you have these rectangles to kind of join everything together to a big shape. So very modular in design. And then this beautiful border around the edge. I think this would be so fun to work on. This version that the designer has is very colorful. You could easily use up a lot of different full skeins of yarn together in a project using a main color to kind of make it all cohesive. I really love the intent behind this blanket, and I really think it's beautiful. That was our last pattern. Thank you so much for joining me for this crochet blanket roundup. As I shared 30 patterns I think would be really a good fit for this Bookish Blanket Make-a-long. Let me talk a little bit more about that. So this make-along is going to start on September 13th and run through the month of November. So a little over 2 months to make your blanket. The minimum requirement is to use up 4 full skeins of yarn, but you can use up as many as you want. Whips are welcome. If you want to enter to win prizes, you need to finish your blanket. I just want everyone to have a chance to make some nice cozy blankets that are perfect for snuggling up with a good book as the weather is cooling down. As I mentioned before, I have another video in this kind of mini series that talks about 30 knit blanket patterns that I also think would be really good for this type of blanket make-along. So make sure to check that out. I'll link it down below and up above as well. Keep an eye out for another small video, just more details about this make-along as we're getting closer, but it is coming up really quick. So I gotta decide what I'm gonna make. I'm not quite sure yet, like which blanket I'm going to work on during this make-along, but I'm so excited to hear about what you're planning to make. Let me know if you've made any of the patterns I talked about today down below, because I'd love to hear. Also, if you have any other blanket patterns you would recommend for this kind of make-along, let us know down below as well, so that we can get some good ideas flowing before the make-along starts. And thank you so much for joining me as I talked about these patterns, and I really hope that you can join me for this Bookish Blanket Make-Along as well. It's coming up in just a few days, and until next time, happy making. Bye.